Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I would like to go over some ideas I had about how CIG could build a complex reputation system. We know that reputation is supposed to be a very important part of Star Citizen, but right now we're seeing a very simple version of what should be a very complex system. So how could the final reputation system be built, and what problems could CIG encounter during development? Keep watching to find out. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here is a shout out to our amazing patrons and channel members for their support of the channel and everything else I do. Before we talk about implementation, we should have a look at what we expect a reputation system to do. The simple and obvious answer is to manage players' reputation. But what does that entail? At a very basic level, we want it to be able to tell us what a player's reputation with a certain faction is, and also allow us to change that reputation as a result of a player's actions. Figuring out what a player's reputation is with a certain faction is very easy. It just has to be retrieved from a database. If that player has no reputation stored, that probably means they never interacted with that faction, so the reputation service should return whatever the default value is. Whatever the result is, the game can use that reputation value to determine what missions are available to the player, or how NPCs belonging to a faction should treat them, or how they show up to other players. Now, changing a player's reputation is a bit more complicated. So let's try to break it down a bit. There are three ways your reputation can change. You can complete a mission generated by the mission system, and that can get you a reputation reward or a reputation loss. This would be things like hauling missions or bounty missions or any other mission or event that you can find in your contract manager. The second way is as a result of a sandbox activity. For example, attacking the members of a certain faction will make you lose reputation with that faction. Or sometime in the future, maybe if you trade with a faction, your reputation will increase. And the final way is that reputation is lost over time if you don't interact with a certain faction. While all of that sounds pretty complicated, it actually outlines all interaction between the game and the reputation service. And it actually does it in a very simple way. Basically, the service needs to be able to handle mission completion, sandbox event occurrence, and it also has to periodically downgrade the reputation where needed. And you can actually make it more flexible by customizing which sandbox events a faction wants to react to. For example, a pirate band might not be too interested in you trading at their base without invitation, but they would be very interested if you attacked their members. This would actually be very easy to implement. CIG are building much of their backend as a separate service, and they are using events to send messages between these services. This is a very common pattern in software development. In simple terms, the different services are connected via an event bus, which is essentially another service. They can either publish events or subscribe to certain events, so the game or the mission service could publish events about missions being completed or failed or abandoned. And the game could publish events about sandbox activities. And then the reputation service can subscribe to those events and process them accordingly. But there is another component to reputation that we need to figure out. Factions in Star Citizen don't exist in a vacuum. Instead, they have relationships. That could be agreements or contracts or a simple gentleman's agreement. At the same time, relationships can be negative, so two factions can be competitors or even enemies in open conflict. So it would make sense that when your reputation changes with one faction, your reputation with related factions might be impacted as well. Currently, this information is stored within the mission system. Every mission has reputation rewards or penalties for every faction that's related to that mission. This is actually a pretty good placeholder system. However, it has two major issues. First, if you want to add a mission, you have to exactly specify every faction that's connected to the faction the mission belongs to, which over multiple missions gets pretty tedious. And second, if you want to add a new faction and connect it to others, you will have to go over all existing missions and add the reputation reward where needed. Long term, this makes the system unsustainable. So how can this be done better? Well, fortunately, there is a structure that can be used to map relationships between many entities, and that would be a graph. So we would need to construct a graph where every node would be one of the factions in Star Citizen, and the edges or connections between the nodes would describe how the reputation value is affected. Think of it as a modifier of the original reputation reward. Let's have a look at a simple example. Let's say that I complete a mission for the Citizens for Prosperity, and that gets me 100 reputation points. And CFP are allied with a faction of outposts. So on our graph, there would be a CFP node and an outpost node. And let's say that they're connected by an edge with a modifier of 0.5. So I will also get 50 reputation points with outposts allied with CFP. However, at the same time, CFP and headhunters are enemies. So there will also be a node for headhunters, which will be connected to the CFP node with a modifier of -1. So I will also lose 100 reputation points with the headhunters. And if the headhunters have any connected nodes, I will be losing some reputation with those factions as well. And the same could work in reverse. For example, I complete a mission for one of the CFP outposts, gaining 100 reputation points with them, which would also get me 50 reputation points with CFP, and I would lose 50 reputation points with the headhunters. This structure could enable some very interesting reputation-centered gameplay. For example, you could build a reputation with one of the sub-factions to gain access to the major one and vice versa, which would allow CIG to have some flexibility in assigning missions to factions. It would also make adding new factions very easy. All you would need to do is add a node to the graph and add some connections with modifiers to existing factions. And technically, removing factions would be fairly easy as well. You would just have to make sure to replace the removed connections. So this would, in theory, allow CIG to have a dynamic list of factions without ever having to edit missions. Obviously, except faction-specific missions that would need to be added or removed. But every mission would only need to have one reputation reward instead of multiple. This system would have two big issues to watch out for when developing it. First would be circular dependencies, meaning a series of factions that are connected into a circle, which could cause a feedback loop. This problem can be avoided simply by not creating the faction relationships this way. But that mostly depends on how complicated does the lore team want the faction relationships to be. But there are other solutions as well, and the best one is actually the same solution that could be used for the second problem, which is how far do we want reputation changes to propagate? If we don't limit this, we could end up in a situation where a reputation change with one faction will result in a change with all factions, which doesn't make sense from a gameplay perspective and would also have pretty terrible performance. Fortunately, the solution is very simple. Just limit how many factions can be affected by one change. The interesting part is that you can make this customizable per mission, and that way you can create missions with various degrees of impact on the environment, which would be another great tool for the mission team and the narrative team to have. Now, some of you are going to say that this sounds great, and some of you are going to say, Space Coder, you're a developer, right? So how would you actually build this? Well, no amount of coffee will make me open Visual Studio and code this on a Sunday. But I have a few high-level ideas on the actual implementation. So what I described so far is a functional overview, and one that would not be terribly difficult to implement. First of all, we know that Star Citizen stores data on two levels. There is the long-term persistent storage that is updated when entities are stowed and unstowed from a shard. And then there is the runtime storage of the shard itself that keeps the data it needs at the moment. So our reputation system would also have to have two layers. It would have a persistent layer which would have a graph of faction relationships and a database storing reputation values of all players. These could be two separate database systems since graph databases and regular databases are pretty different in format and function. But there are database systems that can do both, so that would have to be a decision made by the team and the company. And the second part would be the runtime reputation layer attached to the shard. Now this would likely need to have a local copy of the faction graph and also a copy of reputation of all active players. Which is not a big issue, though it would increase resource cost, but it makes more sense from a performance and data consistency perspective, and it would be in line with the current implementation of persistent storage. We would also need some kind of manipulation logic for the local copy of reputation, which could hook into the existing event communication that CIG are using. The mission system could query the reputation service to find out what the player's reputation is, so it can figure out what missions are available. And it would send information about mission completion so the reputation service can update the reputation database. The game instance could also query the reputation service for reputation values to determine access and behavior of NPCs. From a code writing perspective, this would actually be a fairly simple system. The complicated part would be creating the base faction graph and reputation rewards and then balancing the settings properly, and a lot of debugging. Now, you could also extend this to manage the reputation of player organizations with factions, but that's mostly derived from the actions of the members, so it mostly hooks into the same system. So you will definitely have to have a separate storage to store the org reputation. And you might have a separate modifier for org reputation as it propagates through the faction graph. However, other than that, it should be a pretty simple addition. So the obvious question now is, why aren't CIG doing this? Well, first of all, not all factions and locations and star systems are in place. So there isn't much point in building a faction relationship graph yet, since the existing factions might evolve or be removed, and new ones will be definitely added. Now, while the system I am proposing would support all of that, I think it's too early. Second, even though it sounds simple, it would be a major undertaking. I dare not make an estimate, but developers in the comments are free to post their guesses. But at the moment, many other systems and services are not fully compatible with server meshing, and that should be the priority. A good example would be the mission system itself, with some missions yet to be added back. And finally, the system I proposed would depend heavily on event-based communication within a shard. And from the current state of crime detection and crime stat, I would guess that the game is not doing too well in that area. So there might need to be a major refactor of how the game detects crimes and other sandbox actions and produces events based on that, especially if we want to hook a proper reputation system into that. However, that doesn't change the fact that in-depth reputation is an important part of Star Citizen, and that it will need to be ready before 1.0. And with that being said, that will be all for today. What do you think? How can CIG build the reputation system? Do we need an in-depth reputation system? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.